I was standing on my front porch, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise over my 100-acre estate in Charlottesville, Virginia, when I saw her marching up my private road like she owned the place. The woman had that distinct haircut, the kind you see in memes, and she was clutching a clipboard like it was a weapon. I knew right then my peaceful morning was about to get interesting. "Excuse me, sir," she called out, waving frantically as she approached. "I need to speak with you immediately about some very serious violations." I set my coffee down on the porch railing and waited. My name is Derek Zander, and I had purchased this property 3 years ago. It was a historic estate that had been in disrepair, and I had spent considerable time and money restoring it to its former glory. The main house alone was 8,000 square feet, and the property included stables, a guest house, and about 90 acres of pristine woodland. The remaining 10 acres bordered a newer subdivision that had been built 5 years back. "Can I help you?" I asked as she reached the bottom of my porch steps, slightly out of breath. "I'm Patricia Morrison, president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association," she announced, like I should be impressed. "And your property is in severe violation of our community standards." I actually laughed. "I'm not in your community. My property predates your subdivision by about 150 years. Patricia's face turned an interesting shade of red. "That's irrelevant. Your property borders our development, and as such, you're subject to our rules and regulations. I have letters here from our attorney stating that you need to join our HOA immediately and pay the back dues you owe." "Back dues?" I leaned against the porch post, genuinely curious about where this was going. "For what exactly?" She pulled out a stack of papers and started reading. "Failure to maintain approved exterior paint colors, unauthorized structures visible from the street, excessive tree growth blocking sight lines, and operation of a commercial stable without proper permits." "Those aren't public streets, Patricia. That's my private road. And my stable houses my own horses." "Nevertheless," she said, her voice getting shriller, "you're creating an eyesore that affects our property values. I'm giving you 30 days to comply with our standards or face legal action." I picked up my coffee and took a long sip. "Tell you what, Patricia, you leave those papers on the step and I'll have my attorney look at them. But I can tell you right now, I'm not joining your HOA and I'm certainly not paying you a dime." Her jaw dropped. "You can't just refuse. We have bylaws. Bylaws that apply to your subdivision, not to my private property. Have a nice day." I turned and walked back into my house, closing the door firmly behind me. Through the window, I watched her sputter and fume before finally storming back down the driveway. I figured that would be the end of it. I had dealt with unreasonable people before in my work as a commercial real estate developer, and they usually backed down once they realized they had no legal standing. I was wrong. 2 weeks later, I received a certified letter from an attorney in Charlottesville named Martin Pierce. The letter informed me that I was indeed obligated to join the Meadowbrook Estates HOA due to a zone of inclusion clause that had apparently been filed with the county. According to this clause, any property within 500 feet of the subdivision boundary was subject to HOA oversight. I immediately called my own attorney, a sharp woman named Rebecca Hall who had handled all my property acquisitions. "Rebecca, have you ever heard of something this ridiculous?" "Let me look into it," she said. "Send me everything they sent you." 3 days later, Rebecca called me back. "Derek, this is interesting. There actually is a filing with the county clerk, dated about 6 months before you purchased your property. It's questionable legally, but it's there." "How is that even possible? This property has been here since 1875. "That's the thing. The filing claims to establish a neighborhood aesthetic zone that can include historic properties. It's never been tested in court because, frankly, no one has been crazy enough to try enforcing it. Until now. I sat down heavily in my office chair. So what are my options? We fight it. It'll probably take a year, maybe two, and cost you about $50,000 in legal fees. But you'll win. This kind of overreach never holds up. What if I don't want to wait 2 years? Rebecca was quiet for a moment. What are you thinking? I'm thinking I need to do some research on the history of this subdivision and how it got approved in the first place. Over the next few weeks, I spent hours at the county clerk's office and the zoning commission, digging through old records. What I found was fascinating. The Meadowbrook Estates subdivision had been approved on land that was originally part of my estate. Back in 1998, the previous owner, a man named Harold Sanderson, had sold off 10 acres to a developer named Richard Corman. Corman had built 40 homes, creating the subdivision that Patricia now presided over. But here's where it got interesting. The original sale had included several easements and restrictions that Corman had agreed to. These included maintaining the historic character of the area, preserving certain sight lines to the main estate, and most importantly, acknowledging that the estate retained primary stewardship over the historical nature of the area. I called Rebecca. What does primary stewardship mean in legal terms? It depends on the context and how it was written. Why? Because I think I just found a way to turn this whole situation around. The language in the 1998 agreement was vague, probably intentionally so. But it did establish that my property had a kind of oversight role regarding historical preservation in the area. I started researching further and discovered that the subdivision itself had numerous zoning violations. Several homeowners had built additions without proper permits. The community pool had been constructed on what was supposed to be preserved wetland. And most damningly, the HOA had been collecting fees and funneling them into Patricia's personal accounts. I hired a private investigator, a former cop named James Porter, to dig deeper. What he found over the next month was astounding. Patricia Morrison had been embezzling from the HOA for 3 years, taking over $200,000. She had used the money to buy a vacation home in Florida, a new car, and to fund a lifestyle well beyond what her actual job as a dental receptionist could support. But I still needed more. I needed leverage that would let me flip this entire situation on its head. That's when I discovered the historical preservation angle. My estate was listed on the National Register of Historic Places, which came with certain protections and also certain privileges. One of those privileges was the ability to petition for expanded historical district status if nearby development threatened the historical integrity of the property. I filed a petition with both the county and the State Historical Society, arguing that the Meadowbrook Estates subdivision had been built in violation of historical preservation guidelines, and that it was negatively impacting my protected property. I included photographs, documentation of the zoning violations, and expert testimony from 3 architectural historians. The petition sat in review for about 6 weeks. During that time, Patricia escalated her campaign against me. She started showing up at my property with other HOA board members, trying to physically measure my fence lines and take photographs. I had to call the sheriff's department twice to remove them for trespassing. "You can't keep us out forever," Patricia shouted during the second incident as Deputy Martin escorted her off my property. "We're going to sue you for everything you have." "Looking forward to it," I called back. The turning point came on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. I received a call from Sarah Ortiz, the county's senior historical preservation officer. Mr. Zander, I need to inform you that your petition has been approved at the county level, and the state board has given preliminary approval as well. What does that mean exactly? It means that the area surrounding your estate, including the Meadowbrook Estates subdivision, is now under review for inclusion in an expanded historical district. If the final approval comes through, which I think it will, the subdivision will be subject to historical preservation standards that supersede their HOA rules. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. And who enforces those standards? The historical property owner, which is you, would have significant input. You'd essentially become a steward of the district with veto power over any changes or modifications. This was even better than I had hoped. When will we know for sure? The final hearing is in 3 weeks. I'd recommend you attend. I spent those 3 weeks preparing. Rebecca helped me compile all the evidence of HOA corruption and zoning violations. James Porter continued his investigation and found even more financial irregularities. And I reached out to several homeowners in the subdivision who had been at odds with Patricia's tyrannical rule. One of them, a retired teacher named Margaret Chen, was particularly helpful. "That woman has made our lives hell for 5 years, she told me over coffee at a local cafe. She fines people for having the wrong shade of white on their mailbox. She tried to force my neighbor to remove a tree that had been there before the houses were even built. She's a nightmare." "Would you be willing to testify at the hearing?" I asked. "Absolutely. And I know at least 10 other homeowners who would too." The hearing was held in the county courthouse on a crisp October morning. The room was packed with residents from Meadowbrook Estates, county officials, and representatives from the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. Patricia sat in the front row with her attorney, Martin Pierce, looking confident and smug. The county historical preservation officer opened the proceedings by explaining the petition and the review process. Then she called me to present my case. I stood up and walked to the podium with my prepared statement. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Derek Zander, and I'm the owner of the Sanderson Estate. I purchased this property 3 years ago with the intention of preserving an important piece of Virginia's history. The estate dates back to 1875 and has been meticulously maintained as a representation of post-Civil War architecture and land use." I clicked through a presentation showing the estate's history, its placement on the National Register, and its significance to the area. Then I showed photographs of the Meadowbrook Estates subdivision and how it had been built without proper regard for the historical context. The subdivision you see here was constructed in 1999, and from the beginning, it has been in violation of multiple zoning and preservation guidelines. More concerning is the current HOA leadership's attempt to force my historic property to conform to their modern subdivision standards. Patricia stood up, her face red. "That's a lie. We're simply trying to maintain property values." The judge, a stern-looking woman named Gloria Henderson, banged her gavel. "Mrs. Morrison, you'll have your turn to speak. Sit down." I continued, presenting the evidence of zoning violations, the embezzlement, and the HOA's overreach. Then I played my trump card. "I'm requesting that this hearing not only approve the expanded historical district, but also grant my estate primary authority over the district, as was originally intended in the 1998 easement agreement when the land was sold." Martin Pierce jumped up. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. Mr. Zander is trying to seize control of a private neighborhood." Rebecca stood up smoothly. "Not at all. We're simply asking that the original intent of the historical preservation easement be enforced. The subdivision was built with the understanding that the Sanderson estate retained oversight for historical preservation. That was in the original sales agreement, which I have here." She handed copies to the judge and the Historical Preservation Board members. There was a long silence as they read through the documents. Finally, Judge Henderson spoke. "Mr. Pierce, were you aware of this easement when you took this case?" "Your Honor, that easement is 26 years old and has never been enforced. We believed it was no longer relevant." "That's not how easements work, Counselor. They don't expire simply because they haven't been enforced." The judge turned to the Historical Preservation Board. "What's the board's recommendation?" Sarah Ortiz stood up. "Your Honor, the board recommends full approval of the expanded historical district, with the Sanderson estate granted primary stewardship authority. This would mean that any exterior modifications, construction, or landscaping within the district would require approval from Mr. Zander, working in conjunction with our office." Patricia finally lost it. "You can't do this. This is my neighborhood. I've worked for 5 years to build this community." Judge Henderson's eyes narrowed. "Mrs. Morrison, I've also been provided with evidence of significant financial irregularities in your management of the HOA. I'm ordering a full audit of the HOA's finances, and I'm directing the county attorney to investigate possible embezzlement charges." Patricia's face went white. Her attorney looked like he wanted to disappear. The judge continued. "I'm approving the petition for the expanded historical district, effective immediately. Mr. Zander, you'll work with the Historical Preservation Office to establish guidelines for the district. Mrs. Morrison, you're to cease all HOA enforcement actions pending the financial investigation." "This hearing is adjourned." The gavel came down and the room erupted. Homeowners were talking excitedly, some looking relieved, others confused. Patricia was arguing frantically with her attorney. I just stood there trying to process what had just happened. Rebecca grabbed my arm. "Derek, do you understand what you just did? You essentially annexed an entire subdivision into your estate's sphere of control." "Is that legal?" "Apparently, yes. The historical preservation laws are incredibly powerful and you just use them perfectly." Over the next few days, the full implications became clear. As the primary steward of the new historical district, I had veto power over any changes to properties within Meadowbrook Estates. The HOA could still exist, but it had to defer to my authority on any matter that could affect the historical character of the district, which was basically everything. I received dozens of calls from homeowners in the subdivision. Most were relieved, some were angry, and a few were cautiously optimistic. I scheduled a community meeting at the local library to discuss what this meant for everyone. The meeting was packed. I stood at the front of the room and addressed the crowd of about 60 people. "I know this situation is unusual and probably frightening for some of you. I want to be clear about what my intentions are." I pulled up a presentation on the screen behind me. "First, I'm not interested in making your lives difficult. I'm not going to fine you for minor infractions or dictate what color you can paint your shutters. What I am going to do is work with the county to establish reasonable historical guidelines that protect property values while respecting the history of this area." Margaret Chen raised her hand. "What about the pool and the clubhouse?" Patricia spent a fortune on those. "The pool was built illegally on protected wetland. It's going to have to be removed or relocated. The clubhouse can stay, but it needs to be brought up to code. All of this will be done properly, with proper permits and professional contractors." A man in the back stood up. "What about Patricia? Is she going to jail?" "That's up to the county attorney and the courts. But the financial investigation is ongoing, and I understand they've found significant evidence of embezzlement." Another woman asked, "So, are you our new HOA president?" "No, I'm not part of your HOA and I don't want to be. You can elect new leadership and run your own association. But any decisions that affect the exterior appearance of properties or major construction projects need to go through the historical preservation review process, which I'm part of. The meeting lasted 2 hours, and by the end, most people seemed cautiously supportive. The key was that I wasn't trying to be another Patricia, dictating every aspect of their lives. I just wanted to protect my property and ensure that the area was developed responsibly. The next few months were busy. Patricia Morrison was formally charged with embezzlement and fraud in November. The county attorney, a serious woman named Linda Hayes, built a strong case using the evidence James Porter and I had gathered, along with additional financial records subpoenaed from banks and credit card companies. Patricia's trial was set for February. In the meantime, the subdivision had to function without her iron-fisted rule. They elected new HOA leadership, including Margaret Chen as president. Margaret immediately reached out to me to establish a working relationship. "Derek, I want to thank you," she said during our first official meeting at my estate. "That woman was destroying our community. People were afraid to plant flowers without her approval. I'm glad I could help, but I want to make sure we set up a good system going forward. I don't want to be a bottleneck for every little decision." We worked out a practical arrangement. For minor things like paint colors, landscaping, and small repairs, the new HOA board had full authority as long as they stayed within basic historical guidelines we established together. For major projects like additions, new structures, or significant renovations, those would go through a joint review process with me and the County Preservation Office. I also discovered something interesting during this process. Several homeowners in the subdivision were actually enthusiastic about the historical designation. Property values in historic districts tended to be higher and more stable, and the new guidelines were far less restrictive than Patricia's arbitrary rules had been. One homeowner, a young couple named Tom and Lisa Davidson, even asked if I could help them restore some historical details to their home that the builder had omitted. "We bought here because we loved the history of the area," Lisa told me. "We just couldn't do anything about it with Patricia in charge." I connected them with the architectural historian who had helped with my own restoration, and within a few months, their home looked fantastic, with period-appropriate details that actually increased its value significantly. The trial began in early February. I attended as a witness, along with James Porter and several homeowners who had been victims of Patricia's schemes. The evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution showed how Patricia had systematically stolen HOA funds, created fake invoices for work that was never done, and diverted money meant for community maintenance into her personal accounts. Patricia's defense was that she had been using the money for the good of the community and had always planned to pay it back. Her attorney tried to paint her as a devoted community leader who had made some accounting errors. The jury didn't buy it. After 3 days of testimony and only 2 hours of deliberation, they found her guilty on 12 counts of embezzlement, fraud, and theft. Judge Henderson sentenced her to 5 years in prison and ordered her to pay full restitution of $214,000. As the bailiff led Patricia away, she turned and glared at me. "This is all your fault. You destroyed everything I built." I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. She had destroyed herself through her own greed and tyranny. With Patricia gone and the legal issues settled, life settled into a comfortable routine. The expanded historical district was officially established, and I worked with the county to create comprehensive guidelines that were both protective and reasonable. We even got a grant from the state to create educational materials about the area's history. The relationship between my estate and the Meadowbrook Estates subdivision evolved into something genuinely positive. Instead of being adversaries, we became partners in preserving and enhancing the area. Several homeowners joined the County Historical Society, and we organized an annual historical home tour that became quite popular. Margaret Chen proved to be an excellent HOA president. She ran the association transparently, with regular financial reports and community input on major decisions. The illegal pool was relocated to a proper location, and the community actually came together to help fund and build a better one that met all code requirements. One particularly satisfying moment came about a year after the trial. Tom and Lisa Davidson had done such a beautiful job restoring their home that it was featured in a Virginia preservation magazine. The article highlighted not just their home but the entire historical district, including my estate and the subdivision. "Look at this," Lisa said, showing me the magazine at a community barbecue we had organized. "They're calling this area one of the best examples of historic preservation blending with modern community living in the state." I looked at the photos and read the article with genuine pride. What had started as a confrontation with an unreasonable HOA president had turned into something much larger and more meaningful. The article attracted attention from other communities facing similar issues. I started getting calls from people across Virginia and even other states, asking how we had managed to create such a successful historical district. I ended up giving several talks at preservation conferences, explaining the legal mechanisms and, more importantly, the importance of community cooperation. One of the most interesting developments came from an unexpected source. Richard Corman, the original developer of Meadowbrook Estates, reached out to me. He was retired now, living in Richmond, and he had heard about what happened. "I always regretted how that development turned out," he told me over lunch in Charlottesville. "I had a vision for it that respected the history of your estate, but costs got out of control, and I had to cut corners. Then I sold the management company, and it ended up with people like Patricia running things. It's turned out well in the end," I said, "thanks to you. I want to make it right. I still own some land adjacent to both your estate and the subdivision. I want to donate it to create a historical park, connecting everything together." I was stunned. "That's incredibly generous. It's what I should have done 25 years ago. Let's do it right this time." The park project took another year to complete, but it was worth it. We created walking trails, informational plaques about the history of the area, and a small museum in a restored barn that had been on Corman's property. The park became a centerpiece of the community, used by residents of the subdivision and open to the public. During all of this, my own life continued to evolve. The attention from the historical preservation community led to new business opportunities. Several organizations hired me to consult on projects blending historical preservation with modern development. It became a second career that was both profitable and deeply satisfying. I also met someone special during this time. Sarah Ortiz, the county preservation officer who had been so helpful throughout the process, and I had worked together on dozens of projects over the 2 years since the initial hearing. Our professional relationship gradually became personal. We started dating in the spring following Patricia's trial, and it felt natural and right. Sarah understood and shared my passion for preservation and history. She loved the estate and spent many weekends helping me continue the restoration work that never really ended with a property that old. One evening in late summer, we were sitting on the back porch of the estate, watching the sunset over the woodland that stretched toward the subdivision. You could see some of the homes in Meadowbrook Estates from here, their lights beginning to twinkle as darkness fell. "You know what's funny?" Sarah said, sipping her wine. "Patricia Morrison probably thought she was protecting her little kingdom when she went after you, and instead she lost everything. But everyone else won. The homeowners are happier, the property values are higher, the history is protected, and you got exactly what you wanted." I thought about that. I didn't actually want any of this at first. I just wanted to be left alone to restore my property in peace. But you got something better. You created a real community that respects its past while building its future. She was right. What had started as an absurd attempt by an HOA tyrant to extend her power had ultimately led to something far more positive than I could have imagined. The subdivision that Patricia had tried to use as a weapon against me was now an integral part of a thriving historical district that benefited everyone. The irony wasn't lost on me. Patricia had claimed I was creating an eyesore that would hurt property values. In reality, the historical designation and the improvements we had made increased property values in Meadowbrook Estates by an average of 30% over 3 years. Houses that had been hard to sell under Patricia's regime now had waiting lists of potential buyers who wanted to be part of the historical community. The legal concept that had made all this possible was also fascinating. By using the historical preservation laws creatively, I had essentially been able to annex an entire subdivision into my estate's sphere of influence, but not in a way that hurt anyone. Instead, it had created a framework for cooperation and mutual benefit. I had learned that the best way to deal with unreasonable people wasn't always direct confrontation. Sometimes, it was about finding the legal and ethical framework that made their unreasonable demands irrelevant while creating something better for everyone involved. As fall arrived again, marking 3 years since Patricia had first marched up my driveway with her clipboard and her demands, I reflected on how much had changed. The Meadowbrook Estates subdivision was thriving under sensible leadership. My estate was more beautiful than ever, with ongoing restoration projects that would probably continue for the rest of my life. And I had built relationships with dozens of people in the community who I now considered friends. The historical district had even won an award from the National Trust for Historic Preservation, recognizing it as an innovative model for integrating historic properties with modern development. Margaret Chen and I had traveled to Washington to accept the award together, representing the partnership that had made it all possible. Patricia Morrison served 3 years of her 5-year sentence before being released on parole. I heard through the grapevine that she had moved to another state and was working as a receptionist again, far from any HOA leadership position. I hoped she had learned something from the experience, though I doubted it. Some people never change, but the community had changed. The people of Meadowbrook Estates had learned that good leadership meant serving the community, not controlling it. They had learned that historical preservation didn't mean being stuck in the past, but rather honoring it while building thoughtfully for the future. And I had learned that sometimes the best victories are the ones where everyone wins except the person who tried to make everyone else lose. On a crisp October morning, almost exactly 3 years after that first confrontation, I was again standing on my front porch with my coffee, watching the sunrise over my estate. But this time, when I looked toward the subdivision, I didn't see an enemy or a threat. I saw a community that I was proud to be connected to. Homes filled with families who appreciated where they lived, and a landscape that honored both its past and its future. Sarah came out to join me, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the morning chill. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. Just how strange life is. 3 years ago, I was ready to spend $50,000 and 2 years in court just to be left alone. Instead, I spent the same amount of time and money creating something that involves dozens of people and benefits an entire community. Regrets. I put my arm around her and pulled her close. Not even one. A car pulled up the driveway and I recognized it as belonging to Margaret Chen. She got out, waving enthusiastically. "Derek, Sarah, I'm sorry to bother you so early, but I wanted to tell you in person. We just got the official notification. Our historical district has been designated as a National Historic Landmark." I nearly dropped my coffee. "Are you serious?" "Completely. The ceremony is in 2 months. This is huge. Do you know how few residential districts get this designation?" Sarah was already pulling out her phone to read the official notification. "Derek, this is incredible. This puts your estate and the entire subdivision on the map nationally. The tourism potential alone is enormous." Margaret was practically bouncing with excitement. "I know. And it's all because of what you started. Patricia tried to force you into conforming to her little dictatorship, and instead, you created something that's going to be protected and celebrated for generations." We invited Margaret in for coffee, and we spent the next hour discussing what the National Historic Landmark designation would mean. It came with additional protections, some federal grant opportunities, and significant prestige. It also meant that the story of how this historical district came to be would be documented and shared as a case study in successful preservation. Later that day, after Margaret had left and Sarah had gone to her office, I walked the grounds of my estate. The main house was fully restored now, its 1875 architecture pristine. The stables housed my 4 horses, which I rode regularly through the trails we had created. The guest house had been converted into a small museum documenting the history of the property and the surrounding area. I walked down to the boundary where my property met the Meadowbrook Estates subdivision. 3 years ago, this had been a line of contention, a border across which an HOA president had tried to extend her power. Now it was just a gentle transition from one part of the historical district to another. A young family was walking their dog along the trail that ran through the park Richard Corman had donated. They waved at me, and I waved back. They had just moved into the subdivision last month, attracted by the historical designation and the sense of community. This was what victory looked like, I realized. Not defeating an enemy, but transforming a conflict into an opportunity. Patricia Morrison had tried to force me into her HOA, thinking she could extend her control over my historic estate. Instead, I had effectively annexed her entire subdivision into my estate's sphere of influence, but in a way that made everyone's lives better except hers. The legal mechanism had been elegant in its simplicity. By activating the historical preservation easements and laws, I had created a framework where my authority was derived not from personal power, but from stewardship of something larger than any individual. The historical district didn't belong to me any more than it belonged to the homeowners in the subdivision. We were all temporary caretakers of something that would outlast us all. That evening, I drafted a letter to the National Trust for Historic Preservation, thanking them for the landmark designation and explaining the unusual history of how the district had come to be. I included the story of Patricia's attempted HOA takeover, not to shame her, but to illustrate how conflicts over property rights could be resolved through creative use of preservation law. Several weeks later, I received a reply from the Trust's director. They wanted to feature our story in their quarterly magazine and possibly use it as a case study in their training programs for preservation professionals. What had started as a personal property dispute was now going to educate people across the country about the power of historical preservation. The ceremony for the National Historic Landmark designation took place on a beautiful Saturday in December. Federal officials came from Washington, state representatives attended, and hundreds of community members gathered for the celebration. A bronze plaque was mounted at the entrance to the historical district, marking it as a place of national significance. In my speech at the ceremony, I made sure to acknowledge everyone who had contributed to this success. Margaret Chen and the new HOA leadership, Sarah Ortiz and the County Preservation Office, the homeowners who had embraced the historical vision, and even Richard Corman, who had made amends for past mistakes by donating the park land. I did not mention Patricia Morrison by name, but I did allude to the conflict that had started everything. Sometimes the greatest achievements come from responding to challenges with creativity rather than confrontation. 3 years ago, someone tried to force this historic estate to conform to modern subdivision standards. Instead, we found a way to bring modern development into harmony with historic preservation, creating something neither could have achieved alone. The audience applauded, and I saw Margaret Chen wipe away a tear. She knew better than anyone how bad things had been under Patricia's rule, and how dramatically life had improved for everyone in the subdivision. After the ceremony, there was a reception at my estate. Hundreds of people toured the restored house and grounds, many seeing it for the first time. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive. People were amazed at the quality of the restoration and impressed by the seamless integration with the subdivision next door. One older gentleman approached me during the reception. He introduced himself as Harold Sanderson's son, Edward. "My father owned this estate before you," he explained. "He sold off that 10 acres because he needed the money, and he always regretted it. He thought it would ruin the property." "I'm sorry I never got to meet him," I said. "He passed away 5 years ago, but I think he would be amazed by what you've done. You didn't just restore the estate. You found a way to make the subdivision part of the story instead of a blemish on it. That's extraordinary." We talked for a while about the estate's history, and Edward shared some family stories and old photographs that I eagerly accepted for the museum. It was a reminder that historic preservation wasn't just about buildings and land. It was about the human stories that gave those places meaning. As the sun set on that December evening and the last guests departed, Sarah and I stood on the front porch again, looking out over the estate and the twinkling lights of the subdivision beyond. "You did it," she said quietly. "You took a situation that could have been ugly and expensive and turned it into something beautiful and lasting." "We did it," I corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this without you and everyone else who helped." "So what's next? Are you going to rest on your laurels?" I laughed. "Actually, I got a call from a community in Maryland. They're having a similar issue with an overreaching HOA trying to force a historic property owner to comply with modern standards. They want to know if I can help." "Are you going to?" "I think so. Not for money, just to help them understand what's possible. If we can create more historical districts like this one, we can protect important properties while creating better communities. It's a win-win." Sarah smiled and kissed me. "That's why I love you. You don't just solve problems, you turn them into opportunities." That night, as I lay in bed in the master bedroom of my 1875 estate, I thought about the strange journey that had brought me here. 3 years ago, I had been a commercial real estate developer looking for a quiet retreat and a personal restoration project. I had wanted to be left alone. Instead, a confrontation with an HOA tyrant had forced me to engage deeply with my community, learn the intricacies of historical preservation law, and ultimately create something that would outlast me by generations. The Meadowbrook Estates subdivision that Patricia Morrison had tried to use as a weapon against me was now a thriving part of a nationally recognized historical district, with happy homeowners and rising property values. Patricia herself was gone, serving time for her crimes and then moving away in disgrace. Her attempt to expand her power had instead destroyed her completely while elevating everyone else. There was a lesson in that about the dangers of petty tyranny and the importance of serving rather than ruling. But more than that, there was a lesson about the power of creative problem-solving. Instead of fighting Patricia directly in court, I had found a larger framework, the historical preservation system, that made her demands irrelevant while creating value for everyone. Instead of just defending my property, I had found a way to protect an entire area while building community support. The legal doctrine that made this possible was real and replicable. Historical preservation, easements, and district designations were powerful tools that could protect property rights while promoting responsible development. I hope that by sharing this story, other property owners facing similar challenges might find creative solutions instead of expensive court battles. As I drifted off to sleep, I heard an owl hooting somewhere in the woodland behind the estate. It was a sound that had probably been heard on this land for hundreds of years, and would hopefully be heard for hundreds more, thanks to the protections we had put in place. Karen had tried forcing me into her HOA, threatening my historic property with her petty rules and arbitrary fines. So I had annexed her subdivision into my private estate, not through force or money, but through law and community building. And in doing so, I had created something far better than either of us could have imagined. That was the real victory. Not defeating an enemy, but transforming a conflict into an opportunity that benefited everyone, except the person who had started it with malicious intent. Patricia Morrison had gotten exactly what she deserved, and everyone else had gotten something far better than they had hoped for. Justice, it turned out, didn't always come from a courtroom or a jury verdict. Sometimes it came from finding the elegant solution that made everyone's life better while making the bad actors' behavior irrelevant. That was the sweetest kind of justice, the kind that built something lasting instead of just tearing someone down. And as I fell asleep in my restored 1875 mansion, now the centerpiece of a National Historic Landmark district that included 40 modern homes whose residents were proud to be part of something larger than themselves, I smiled. Because sometimes the best revenge wasn't revenge at all. It was success, shared generously with everyone except those who had tried to tear you down. Patricia Morrison had tried to force me into submission. Instead, I had turned her subdivision into part of my legacy. And that legacy would stand long after both of us were gone, a testament to what was possible when you responded to pettiness with vision and to threats with creativity. The next morning, I woke up to my phone ringing. It was a reporter from the Washington Post who wanted to do a feature story on the historical district and the unusual circumstances of its creation. I agreed to the interview, seeing it as another opportunity to spread the word about creative solutions to property disputes. Over the following months, the story gained national attention. The Washington Post article was picked up by other media outlets. I did interviews with several preservation magazines and even appeared on a PBS special about innovative approaches to historic preservation. Each time I told the story, I made sure to emphasize the lessons that others could learn. Use the law creatively. Build community support. Focus on creating value rather than winning fights. And most importantly, understand that sometimes the best way to protect your rights is to find a framework that benefits everyone, except those acting in bad faith. The Maryland community I had mentioned reached out again, and I spent several weekends helping them navigate a similar situation. Using the same approach, identifying historical easements and preservation opportunities, they were able to create their own protected district and neutralize an overbearing HOA. Other communities followed. Within 2 years of our National Historic Landmark designation, I had consulted on 12 similar projects across Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and even one in North Carolina. Each situation was unique, but the underlying principle was the same: finding the legal and community framework that turned a conflict into an opportunity. Sarah and I got married in the spring following the landmark designation. The wedding was held on the grounds of the estate, with the ceremony in the restored garden and the reception in a tent on the lawn. Guests included people from the subdivision, county officials, preservation professionals, and family and friends from across the country. Margaret Chen gave a toast at the reception that brought tears to many eyes. 3 years ago, our neighborhood was under the thumb of a tyrant who made our lives miserable. Derek could have just fought her in court and left us to our fate. Instead, he found a solution that freed all of us and created something beautiful that will last for generations. That's the mark of a true leader, someone who solves problems by lifting everyone up instead of just defending themselves. As I stood there with Sarah's hand in mine, surrounded by friends and community members in a place I loved, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Life had taken unexpected turns, but they had led somewhere better than I could have planned. The estate continued to thrive. I finished the last major restoration project, the old carriage house, converting it into an event space that the community could use for weddings, meetings, and gatherings. It became a popular venue, bringing in revenue that funded ongoing maintenance and preservation work. The subdivision continued to improve as well. Under Margaret's leadership, and freed from Patricia's petty tyranny, homeowners invested in their properties, planted beautiful gardens, and created a genuine sense of community. The annual home tour became a major event, drawing thousands of visitors and generating significant tourism revenue for local businesses. 5 years after that first confrontation with Patricia Morrison, I stood on my front porch on another October morning, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise. Everything had come full circle, but in a way that had transformed everything. My estate was no longer an isolated property defending itself against encroachment. It was the centerpiece of a thriving historical district, a national historic landmark that educated and inspired people from across the country. The subdivision that had threatened to diminish my property had instead become an integral part of its story, proof that historic preservation and modern development could coexist and even enhance each other. And Patricia Morrison, the HOA tyrant who had tried to force me into submission, had inadvertently catalyzed something far greater than either of us. Her overreach had been the spark that led to the creation of a nationally recognized historical district, the protection of important properties, and the improvement of an entire community. Sometimes I wondered if she understood the irony from wherever she was now. She had tried to extend her little kingdom by 500 feet onto my property. Instead, I had extended my estate's influence to cover her entire subdivision, not through conquest but through community building and legal creativity. She had tried to force me to conform to her standards. Instead, her neighborhood now had to conform to historical standards that I helped enforce, but it wasn't about revenge or victory over her personally. That was the beautiful part. Everything I had done had been focused on creating value, protecting history, and building community. Patricia's defeat was simply a side effect of everyone else's success. That was the lesson I shared whenever I told this story. The best way to deal with unreasonable people wasn't always direct confrontation. Sometimes it was finding a larger framework that made their unreasonable demands irrelevant while creating something better for everyone else. As the sun climbed higher and the day began, I went inside to start my work. I had consultations scheduled with 2 more communities facing HOA over each. I had a board meeting for the local historical society, and Sarah and I were having dinner with Margaret Chen and some other neighbors from the subdivision to plan the next year's home tour. It was a good life, built on the foundation of turning a threat into an opportunity. Karen had tried forcing me into her HOA, so I had annexed her subdivision into my private estate, transforming a conflict into a legacy that would last for generations. And I would never regret a single moment of it.